back. As part of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin's arrest and charges, the medical examiner has released preliminary findings about Floyd's death to the public. Dr. Payal Kohli joins us live. Now, Dr. Kohli, thank you for speaking on this today, because for months you've been giving us your expertise on the pandemic. But today, we want your medical perspective on this report. So, doctor, walk us through the timeline of this incident according to the report.
So, Sam, based on the charging documents, we know that the police arrived at the scene at 8:08 p.m. At 8:19 p.m., Mr. Floyd was placed face down, handcuffed behind his back, and ex-officer Chauvin actually placed his knee on his neck at that point. It was also found in the charging documents that two other officers also held him down with weight on his back and his legs. And as you can imagine, from a medical standpoint, being face down with your hands cuffed behind your back makes it extremely difficult to breathe and extremely difficult to expand your chest if you've got extra weight on your back. In fact, he was repeatedly yelling out that he couldn't breathe. There was also a bystander that noticed he had blood coming out of his nose, and this could have been due to possible facial trauma. At 8:24 p.m., he went unresponsive, and at 8:25 p.m., Mr. Floyd was noted not to be breathing or speaking, and one of the officers commented that they could not find a pulse. Despite not finding a pulse, and despite being trained in CPR, none of the officers actually initiated CPR at that point. In fact, ex-officer Chauvin continued to have his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for another 2 minutes and 53 seconds until the ambulance arrived at 8:27. Finally, he got off at 8:27. The ambulance arrived. They started CPR. They tried an IV. They tried medications. They tried to shock Mr. Floyd's heart, but none of those measures were reported to have worked. And at 9:25 p.m., he was pronounced dead at the medical center.
I'm sick to my stomach.
You should be, Sam. Are there any other big takeaways, Doc? I know they tried to say that he had a history of heart disease and alcohol in his system. Can you debunk those?
Yeah, so let's talk about this. This was a very preliminary report, but there were some curious findings that I was surprised to see in a medical examiner's report. So the first was this supposition that he had underlying hypertensive heart disease and coronary artery disease, which as a cardiologist, I see a lot, particularly in the young African-American community, but that doesn't necessarily lead to somebody's death. And the fact that Mr. Floyd, who was only 46 years old, ended up dying from these conditions, supposedly, just means that he may have been more sensitive to that lack of oxygen. And that's how I would interpret that.
Even if he
did. Second finding that
I'm sorry, I just have to intervene right now. Even if he did, and I know that it's brought up for nefarious purposes, but even if he did, he was screaming out, "I can't breathe." He was unresponsive. They checked his pulse, could have intervened, had an aha moment right there if they would have had some sort of conscience. And then Chauvin still kept his knee on his neck. So I don't care what they find in the report. It's blatant murder, in my opinion, just by watching the actions in that video.
You're absolutely right, Sam. And at any point, we know that the difference between life and death is starting CPR right away. In fact, a few seconds of CPR can make that difference, and he didn't get it for 3 minutes. The other thing that was curious in the report was this potential intoxicants. Do they have the toxicology report? Did he have intoxicants or didn't he? And then finally, this finding that he didn't have traumatic asphyxia does not, to your point, rule out asphyxia as a cause of death. So this just basically tells us that he didn't have trauma to the trachea, but he could very much have still died from lack of oxygen. And those were his last words: "I can't breathe. I'm going to die."
Right. Thank you, Dr. Kohli.
Thanks, Doc. We appreciate you.
Yep. You will be back tomorrow, and Dr. Kohli will talk further about the medical concerns surrounding the protests. Is there a way to protest safely? Should we expect a spike in cases because everybody turning out? That's tomorrow on DBL.